As the Louisiana Territory began to become surveyed, it also began to be divided into um, administrative territories. In the case of the Arkansas Territory and Missouri Territory, Louisiana was admitted as a state in 1812. By 1817, Missouri had a sufficient population that it began um, to sort of push for statehood. It already had a significant population to begin with, thanks to the presence of St. Louis in Missouri, and its its prospective membership or statehood, created a problem, and the problem was basically this: it was important, especially to the slave states, to maintain a balance of power in the Senate, which meant that there had to be um, the same number of slave states and free states, so that each state would have two senators, and of course has two senators, and then um, they would have equal representation in the U.S. Senate. And this was, from a slaveholder's perspective, this was really important in terms of protecting what they called the peculiar institution. So this is the challenge that awaited the country, and this crisis began in 1819 when the business of admitting Missouri as a state could no longer be put off. Now, if you look at Missouri, it's pretty far north, and an argument can be made that it really ought to be maybe a free state. I mean, look at every state to the east of it. It's about the same latitude: Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. So the idea that it'd be a slave state was a little problematic. But more problematic is that if it were admitted, um, it would put one more state in the column of the slave states, and so that was also problematic. Um, so this Missouri crisis that began in 1819 continued into 1820. And Henry Clay of Kentucky, eventually called the Great Compromiser, was the driving force at behind arriving at a compromise that uh, that would deal with the problem. And this was the resolution of the crisis. It was something called the Missouri Compromise, and within a few years of the creation of the Missouri Compromise, it was treated with practically the same weight that was given to the Constitution. It was considered to be a permanent solution, and this becomes important in the 1850s, specifically with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which you probably haven't heard of at this point, but you definitely will. Okay, this is what Clay came up with. Missouri would be admitted as a slave state, but it would be balanced by Maine as a free state. Now, up until this time, Maine was actually part of Massachusetts, but now it was going to be its own state. So you have equal representation in the U.S. Senate once again. So far, so good. There was also this question of, how far north there were going to be slave states in the future, because particularly in the Midwest. So by that I'm talking about Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan territory, not yet a state there. But there were a lot of white people there who wanted to settle farther west. Figure they could build a new life there. They did not want to compete against slave labor. A great deal of anti-slavery sentiment that you're going to encounter is not driven by any kind of humanitarian concern for enslaved Americans, but driven rather by this desire, not to have to compete with unfree labor, with slave labor. So the other part of the compromise was that, hey, in the future, there can be slavery um, below a line, and we're going to establish this line, and it is 36 degrees 30 minutes north latitude. Okay? And that coincides with the southern boundary of Missouri, and basically that latitude, 36 degrees 30 minutes north latitude, would be extended as far as um, the United States territory extended, so that if the United States territory eventually extended all the way to the Pacific, it would extend all the way there. That diffused the crisis, and the crisis was serious enough when it began that Thomas Jefferson, who was still alive, he would not die until 1826, called it a fire bell in the night, because he, as one of the founders, had always been concerned about slavery as a divisive issue at the national level. And here it was, a major crisis already during his lifetime. Okay, this is an older slide. I'll just move on past it. All right. The next thing, in terms of this evolving sectional controversy, and by sectional controversy, I guess I'm talking about the way in which the country was being divided according to, the northern section and the southern section, you know, and it was a real struggle to try to keep their interests aligned, and their interests were best aligned by keeping slavery out of the national conversation. But slavery intruded once again, sort of indirectly, with the nullification crisis of 1832. Now, we've already talked about the nullification crisis once already in connection with the rise of Jacksonian democracy. But another aspect of it that we didn't touch upon is that although directly focused on the federal tariffs of 1828 and 1832, which Northerners, incipient manufacturing, um, incipient manufacturers in the Northeast favored, um, you know, Southern states very much did not like, because what it meant was imported goods were going to be more expensive for them, and they weren't going to get any compensating benefit out of these tariffs. They were protective tariffs, which meant that these were not revenue producing customs, was the way that the United States produced most of its revenue back in the day. It didn't have an income tax, had limited excise taxes. It was basically customs duties and the sale of federal lands. That is what gave the United States its budget. So, so you have these customs duties and land sales. But with regard to the customs duty, if you wanted to protect American manufacturing as it began to find its way, what you needed to do to allow it to compete against European projects, what you needed to create was called a protective tariff. And that is a tariff that is high enough to create a barrier, to um, effective competition on the part of foreign manufacturers, because that tariff, which merchants have to pay when goods from abroad come in, that tariff was so high that merchants wouldn't want to pay it. They would rather buy from a domestic manufacturer instead. That was the way these tariffs were supposed to work. Again, great news for the evolving textile industry, for example, in the Northeast. Very bad news for the South, which got no benefit from this high protective tariff. So that creates the nullification crisis. And of course, the nullification crisis was on its face, hey, there's a federal law about these high protective tariffs and so forth, but we don't want to apply those high protective tariffs, here in, South Carolina, like in Charleston or in the port of Savannah, or any other southern thing. We want to nullify that federal law. So you get the nullification crisis. But there's another thing about nullification as a doctrine, because it also tested one way by which Southern slaveholders could protect the institution of slavery against encroachment by a federal law or laws aimed at crippling the institution. Even though under the Constitution, the United States government lacked the legal power to end slavery outright, it might be able to pass laws that made the maintenance of slavery more difficult, might create law enforcement provisions, or or some kind of law, or permit some kind of law that made it more difficult to recover fugitive slaves, and and so forth. And so they're just worried about that kind of a thing. And nullification doctrine, if it could be put in place, would solve that problem. So, this ability to nullify federal laws within one's own state would, if successfully created, do a lot to protect slavery. And the mastermind behind nullification as protection for slavery was South Carolina John C. Calhoun, who ironically, when this nullification crisis began, was still Vice President Andrew Jackson's vice president. You know, but he would soon revert to being a senator from South Carolina, and that's where he would spend the rest of his career. By the way, well, once again, Henry Clay, senator of Kentucky, the great compromiser, once again came to the rescue. He'd handled the Missouri Compromise. Now he dialed things back with his nullification crisis. Jackson obviously, strongly opposed South Carolina's threat of nullification to avoid the impact of the tariffs. At one point, he threatened to hang Calhoun higher than Haman, which is a biblical reference. I mean, hang somebody pretty high. If this thing didn't get taken care of, he threatened to let loose the army in order to prevent South Carolina from making good on this nullification threat. I mean, he really came down hard, but at the same time, he privately he allowed Henry Clay of Kentucky, who had been his political enemy. Remember, one of the two parties of the corrupt bargain that had cost Jackson election as president back in 1824. John Quincy Adams being the other one. So, he doesn't like Clay, but he knows that Clay is really good at this business of, legislating compromises that, resolve things and get things back to normal. So Clay put together a bill that slowly lowered the federal tariff rates to a point that the southern states could live with. And this cemented Clay's reputation as the great compromiser. And one of the things I just kind of want to mention in passing is that, once upon a time, compromise was a good thing in American political life. People liked compromise. One of the things about compromise is it diffuses crises rather than exacerbates them. One of the virtues of compromise is that you get legislation passed. Hey, I want this, and I don't want it so much, and well, let's let's work on this thing until we can reach an agreement that neither one of us likes, but both of us can live with. And so you get legislation passed that way. Nowadays, one of the real problems is that the the two political parties, major political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, don't like to compromise. By and large, there's a strong culture of sort of ideological purity at work. So some legislation does go through on a bipartisan basis, but a lot of legislation either goes through on a straight party line vote, so that the other side feels completely left out and doesn't view the outcome as really very legitimate, um, or you just don't get much legislation passed. And what's going on nowadays is that when legislation doesn't get passed and something needs to be done, the president does it by executive order. And the question is whether that is a healthy process. You know, if 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 obligations or constitutional rights and responsibilities that repose in Congress under the Constitution, if they're not being done, and so the executive branch, which does not have authority to do them, does them anyway by executive order and comes up with a legal rationale that will permit them to do that. Is that healthy? So even though eventually the sectional crisis, you know, drives the country right off a cliff into a civil war that we know all about, and we know that A lot of Americans got killed. And we also know there were a lot of cool battles and so forth, and great uniforms and famous generals and this kind of thing. A lot of Americans are really like steeped in the Civil War, at the same time oblivious to the fact that it represented a very serious query as to the idea as to whether Republican government would work here in the United States. So, okay. Another element, trying to keep slavery out of the politics at the national level was something we've seen before, and that is the gag rule. Um, John Quincy Adams hated the gag rule, but the gag rule was basically this: Americans have the right to petition their government for redress of grievances, and so abolitionists would regularly petition their government for redress of grievances. And eventually, a parliamentary rule was adopted that such petitions would be received. Hey, we got to take this thing in. It's a petition from the American public, and they're exercising their right to petition their government for redress of grievances. But hey, once we've got it, once we've received it, then as a parliamentary thing, we're going to immediately table it, um, which is a way of saying we're not going to deal with it. It's just it's business we're not going to deal with now, and it's business we may never deal with later. And what this meant was that there were never any discussions about slavery in Congress, thanks to this gag rule, which lasted until 1844. Well, along comes another problem, and it is an evolving war with Mexico. The war itself doesn't come along until 1846, but tensions arise um, earlier because Mexico had kind of a problem on its hands. It had gained independence from Spain in 1821, and the area south of the present day border between the United States and Mexico was well populated. But the area north of the Rio Grande, the area that we think of as being the border, that was sparsely populated, which meant that it could not be developed very well economically. And so the Mexican government, like we kind of wondering about this, decided, hey, let's let's set conditions that make it easy for Anglo-American, um, people from the United States to settle into Texas, what is now Texas, and a lot of settlers did, particularly people who had were having financial problems at home. They just kind of walked away from them, and you would find on the accounting ledgers, hey, we so and so owes us money. Where the heck are they? Where's the money? And on the ledger would be GTT, standing for Gone to Texas. And another interesting thing about allowing Anglo-American settlers into what is now Texas is that Mexico had abolished slavery. It wasn't allowed in Mexico, but they made an exception for Texas. And so, because these Anglo-American settlers, would want to have their property and slaves, that was the way that these Anglo-American settlers would be improving uh, the land and producing economic activity. They'd be doing it through the exploitation of unfree labor. Well, this arrangement of Anglo-American settlers in Texas um, eventually produced a crisis between um, the Anglo-American settlers and also the Tejanos, the Mexicans already living in Texas. Both of them had problems with the excuse me, the Mexican um, head of state, um, and um, gosh, I'm sorry, I'm really working on too little sleep. Um, anyway, oh, President Santa Anna. I wasn't coming up with that. he was turning into kind of a dictator, and he was coming up with sort of repressive policies, and neither the Anglo Americans nor the Tejanos in Texas liked it. So in 1836, they started a revolution. And what they wanted to gain was independence from the rest of Mexico. And again, you know, there were Anglo Americans and Tejanos both involved in this Texas Revolution. We tend to think it was all Anglo American and so forth, but it wasn't. The most famous battle of this Texas Revolution, as it's called, was the Battle of the Alamo. And it's like everybody's heard of the Alamo. If you haven't heard of the Alamo, well, you're about to find out. This is a screenshot from a movie called The Alamo in 1960. John Wayne um, financed it, produced it, directed it, starred in it. Uh, he liked Alamo's story because it was a story of American valor, American determination. The way that he wrote the script got written was that it was a contest between um, freedom and tyranny, and of course this had strong echoes of the contest between the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States was like about freedom. The Soviet Union was about slavery, in effect. The Soviet Union kept very close control on its people. There wasn't much political freedom. There wasn't much, freedom of speech. There wasn't much of anything. And this seemed to be the 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 kind of governmental system that the Soviet Union wanted to sort of export worldwide. So that was the subtext of the Alamo. But overtly, what goes on is the Alamo, which is located in San Antonio, which back in the day was um, a village. Right nowadays, San Antonio is a huge metropolitan area, and it completely surrounds the Alamo. But the Alamo was a Catholic mission that was in somewhat disrepair. But the great thing about this Catholic mission was that it had high walls, and the architecture was such that it made a kind of a fort, and with very little sort of improvements on different sides of the walls, you actually could make it into a fortified position, and you could and the Anglo Americans, did this fortified the Catholic mission, and they put some cannon at the top, and they had a garrison of a little bit north of 200, but not quite 300, I think. And the role of the Alamo was that as Santa Anna came north with his army to try to put down the Texas Revolution, um, the garrison of the Alamo was to hold out long enough for other Texas troops to come up and, in effect, reinforce the situation and sort of take over. And everybody in the Alamo expected, that mostly they were going to survive this experience. Well, the Mexican army arrived and began its preparations for an attack. And they didn't attack right away. They took their time about it, and they got everything in place, and they're all their ducks in a row. And the men inside the Alamo held out for 13 days until finally the Mexican army made a major attack with its vastly superior forces. And according to legend, the um, the garrison was wiped out to the last man. That's legend. Probably a few people survived. We even think that one of the major figures, Davy Crockett, who's supposed to have been like this great hero and so forth, that he might have actually survived for a while. That basically he surrendered and they killed him, is what I'm saying. Everybody, and this is the only thing that people remember about the Texas Revolution. Um, well, the Alamo goes down, but because it held out for 13 days, that gave the commander of the Texas Army, a guy named Sam Houston, for whom the city of Houston is named, time to assemble uh, a real army and get it halfway decently trained and so on. And just a little bit over a month after the Alamo, Santa Anna's army was attacked. It was a surprise attack by the Texas Army under Sam Houston. And in a battle, the Battle of San Jacinto, which is near present day Houston, within a matter of minutes, the Mexican army was defeated and Santa Anna himself was captured. And basically, Santa Anna was presented with, surrender terms that were like, sort of possibly enforced by his extinction if he didn't go along with it. So basically, he agreed to these terms under what's called duress. He didn't want to do them, but hey, he didn't really have any particular choice. So he agreed to grant Texas its independence, and he agreed to a southern boundary of the Rio Grande. That was the understanding the Texans had of the southern boundary. Subsequently, Santa Anna reneged on this and said, "Well, first of all, I don't really think you guys are independent, you know, and it's just possible I may try to take back this territory again. But in any event, I don't like you. And as far as it goes, the southern boundary is not at the Rio Grande; it is at the Nueces River, and that is considerably north. No one's ever heard of it. If you look at that map, you can kind of, sort of, maybe see it. It's a little ribbon of blue north of the Rio Grande River. Well, the upshot is that Texas became a republic, and it remained a republic for about 10 years. Uh, but sooner rather than later, it thought, well, it's kind of nice being a republic, but something, there's a big downside, which is that we're not a terribly strong republic. It's not only the Mexicans that are pressuring us, it's also the British that are pressuring us for reasons that need not detain us. What we'd like more is for the United States to annex us. Well, this became a problem because the Whig Party, by and large, was skeptical about annexing Texas. It was going to be more slave territory, and they weren't wild about that. And it was going to probably risk another war with Mexico. Mexico basically said, "Hey, United States, if you annex Texas, we're going to get pretty hot and bothered about it, and we might go to war over it." And the Whigs were like, "Man, we really don't need to do this. We don't need to expand like this." What the Whigs wanted to do was to create more infrastructure um, within the United States as it already existed. But there was an election in 1844, and you had a Whig candidate, which I think was Henry Clay, come to think of it. And the 1840, the Democratic candidate in 1844 was very definitely James Knox Polk, uh, called Young Hickory. Um, he was a protege of Andrew Jackson, and Polk was very firmly in favor of expansion, very firmly in favor of Texas annexation, very firmly in favor of extending American territory all the way to the Pacific Ocean, because the Pacific Ocean, you have the port of San Francisco, which opened up the possibility of trans-Pacific trade, which was good. And then if you look up in the Northwest, you see what's something called the Oregon Country. And the Oregon Country was sparsely populated during this period, and it was kind of jointly occupied between the United States and Great Britain. And one of the things the Democrats wanted to do was like kick out the Brits and take over the entire Oregon territory. That was, and even more than that, they wanted to go into what's now present day Canada. And those were the things that Polk wanted to do. A couple of other things he wanted to do too, but those were the main ones. And his election in 1844, by actually a fairly narrow margin, I think if 16,000 votes had gone a different way, the outcome of the Electoral College would have been to place Henry Clay in the White House, rather than James Knox Polk. And if that was the case, American expansion might have taken place, much more slowly. But there was an ideological reason underpinning the American push for expansion, which is mostly a democratic push. But there were a lot of Americans who were not otherwise very political who liked the idea of expansionism, and it was and that the idea of this expansionism uh, sort of rested under a philosophy called manifest destiny. It came from something that a newspaper editor named John L. Sullivan said that it was manifestly the destiny of the United States to extend, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and a lot of people bought into that. I'm going to stop here. I want you to watch a required video about manifest destiny, and then we'll pick up on the other side.